Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the latest event within our Hot Topic series entitled, Is the Future of Work Missing the Opportunity for Inclusion? I'm Caroline Gadsby, Head of Thought Leadership Insight for Women in Banking and Finance, and we're delighted to host this event today in collaboration with Capco. I'm so pleased to have with us Dee, Rosie, Harriet, and Neil for what I know will be a fascinating discussion and one that I'm particularly interested as well. It's fair to say that questions around the future of work in this post-pandemic world affect us all and will likely shape society for years to come. It's great to see lots of familiar faces as well as new guests on the call today. I'd like to kick off with a few words about Women in Banking and Finance. We're the longest running gender network in the UK, and this year is our 41st year. We're not-for-profit, run by members and for members. We have branches in London, Manchester, Birmingham, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Bristol, and we very recently launched a new branch in Belfast. So welcome to all of you joining us from around the UK. And I would like to extend a special welcome also to Capco's guests. As an organization, we run over 100 events a year across our different programs. And now that our events are digital, as a member, you can attend as many events as you want. You're not held back by location, so please do take advantage of this current benefit. We run a popular mentoring program for our members. We have a jobs board, which pulls together all our open roles from our corporate members, and also gives you information about workplace and diversity initiatives, gender pay gap information, and returners programs. Last year, we also launched the first cross-sector financial services research program with a gender lens. So do look out for our first year report, which will be released in June. So on to today's event, just to let you know that we are recording this event and we will share the link with you afterwards. Today, I'd like to welcome our chair, Dee McDougal from Capco, who will lead the event and who will introduce our panelists in just a few moments. Dee is Global Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at Capco. She joined the firm earlier this year from Pacific Western Bank, where she led corporate diversity and inclusion strategy and developed education and engagement programs for internal and external audiences. Dee has been a member of several industry committees and advisory groups, including Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Advisory Group and Professional Development Council of the American Bankers Association. Dee was named one of Triangle Business Journal's 40 Under 40 and was named a BizWoman headliner and rising star by American City Business Journals. We're delighted to have Dee join us from the US today. During the event, we will be running some polls which will appear on your screen. If you could just take a few seconds to answer the question on your screen, it will guide our panel discussion. You also have the opportunity to drop your questions in the chat at any point, and we'll have some time at the end of the event to address your questions. And now I'd like to hand over to Dee to kick off our discussion.
Thanks, Caroline. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to join you today. Just a little note about Capco before we get started. We are a global technology and management consultancy driving digital transformation in financial services. Our growing client portfolio includes over 100 global organizations that we serve across our key domains, which include banking and payments, capital markets, wealth and asset management, insurance, and the energy sector. Capco also offers an amazing Be Yourself at Work culture where we invite employees to be themselves at work, and we also embrace difference and give opportunities for all employees to advance their careers. I'm really excited to moderate today's conversation about future ways of working and how we can leverage these times as an inflection point to drive increased inclusion and really more access for individuals, specifically women in the workplace. Today, we'll talk about autonomy, independence, emotional well-being, and building high-performance teams. We'll also talk about the need to adapt coaching for women in this environment, and we'll cover these topics from a broad range of angles, from employee to people leaders to the systems that are in place within our workplaces. With that, I am pleased to introduce Harriet Minter, journalist and broadcaster, author of the recently published book, Working from Home, How to Build a Career You Love When You're Not in the Office, Professor Rosie Campbell, Professor of Politics and Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London, and my colleague, Neil Hunsworth, UK HR Director at Capco. Harriet, I'll start with you. Can you tell us just a little bit about yourself, including your professional background?
Sure, thank you so much, Dee. So my name is Harriet Minter. I am a journalist, broadcaster and consultant, and as of last month, an author, which is very exciting. I haven't yet got over the self-promotion stage of it, as you can see. I have spent kind of 15 years as a journalist, and the latter half of that essentially writing about women and work. And I started doing that for The Guardian in 2012, I think. And we basically became the first national newspaper to specifically talk about the challenges facing women in the workplace. And the more I wrote about that, the more I realized that actually all of those problems facing women faced everyone, and they were just impacting us in different ways. And so I kind of decided to dedicate the rest of my working life to making our workplace fit for the future. So our working world was designed essentially by Henry Ford in 1921. We haven't kept a lot else from 1921, 100 years later. So it seems strange to me that we've kept 9 to 5, 5 days a week in an office. And earlier this year, I wrote WFH, How to Build a Career You Love When You're Not in the Office, specifically to talk about this period when we go back from working at home to our probably now hybrid office lives, and how actually we can design work to fit us now in 2021 as opposed to 1921. So that's a bit about me.
Great. Neil, what about you?
Thanks, Dee. Delighted to be on the panel today and to be an esteemed company as well. So as Dee said, I'm the HR Director in the UK for Capco. So I've been at Capco since 2017. I guess I'm at a stage in my career where I can't remember exactly how many years I've been in HR, so let's just 15 plus and leave it at that. I've worked across multiple different sectors, the majority of my career in professional services and consulting, in a combination of global, regional and UK roles. And particularly in my current role at Cap, a strong emphasis on diversity, equity and inclusion, along with Dee, part of our global DE&I steerco at Capco, where we're looking to drive change in terms of bringing about an environment of inclusion and greater diversity across Capco globally. So delighted to be part of this panel. I'm also the global lead for wellbeing at Capco, so very interested in how some of the different topics dovetail today and the synergies between inclusion, flexibility and wellbeing.
Rosie?
Hi, I'm absolutely delighted to join you. I'm Professor Rosie Campbell, Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. We're really an organisation that's really designed to bring evidence into these debates about how we make work more inclusive and better for everybody.
Great, thanks. And as we talk about evidence, that's a segue, a great segue into our first question. So Rosie, I understand that you have recently released a report, The New Ways of Working, the Lasting Impact and Influence of the Pandemic, which was published almost a week ago. Can you share what the team learned as part of your research?
Yes, that's why I was a little bit brief, because I'm going to say a little bit about the Institute. I've got some slides to share. So so the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London, I've introduced this a little bit already. Our chair is Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia, the only woman to hold the position. And we are all about trying to bring evidence into debates about how we help women access leadership positions and ensure they're treated fairly when they get there. My next slide is briefly showing some of the other issues around. I'm sure everyone on this call is aware about the impacts of the COVID crisis, particularly on women and people with caring responsibilities. We know that women have done a disproportionate share of both the paid and unpaid caring workers in response to the crisis. They've disproportionately been represented in lockdown sectors. They've seen greater cuts to their working hours, and indeed there are greater risks in terms of socialization, isolation, in terms of potential violence against women and girls. So this crisis has not been a good one at all for women and girls, and potentially sees us going backwards rather than forwards. A piece of research we've done recently has looked at the furlough scheme in the UK and shown that actually women would be more likely to be furloughed than men for longer periods, and that they've got worse perceptions about their job security going forward after being furloughed, and worse concerns about their future financial security after being furloughed. So that's a very brief whiz through the context that we find ourselves at this moment, as we hope that we're about to move into a recovery period from the crisis. So we come to my next slide. So last week we published this report with Karen and Box, the employment engagement company, surveying more than 250 large employers to try and see, okay, what is the lasting impact and influence of the pandemic likely to be on carers in particular? And we found on my next slide, there's a really mixed picture here. So the overwhelming majority of employers think that there are going to be positive outcomes coming from this crisis. They think there's going to be positive organizational change. And in fact, you know, as already been mentioned, 97% think that they're going to have some form of hybrid working going forward. But balanced against that optimism, you can see that 37% of the employers that we surveyed are going to be restructuring and introducing redundancies as a part of this process. That's a very large figure. 4 and 5 are positive about how the lasting changes to work will impact on our lives. 90% report an increase in support for home working, 97% for hybrid working. But how does this reflect on the experience of parents and carers? Well, we know that 2 in 3 parents and carers have faced financial and career costs during this crisis. And most alarmingly, our survey showed that 32% of organisations have got policies in place to mitigate against those people who've undertaken caring being disproportionately affected by redundancies. But that leaves a huge section who actually haven't put any specific policies in place. Likewise, there are huge opportunities for us in terms of hybrid working. Now, we sort of have to caveat that those of us who have the privilege of being able to work from home sometimes, we tend to be the more privileged part of the population economically, and not everybody, core workers, frontline workers, haven't had that opportunity. But going forward, knowledge workers, workers who can work from the office, there's a real opportunity for more flexibility. But actually, that's only going to be successful in terms of inclusion if we think about actually how are we working, not just where are we working. So 77% of the organisations that we surveyed are increasing support for flexibility, 63% for parents and carers, and only 43% for part-time working. And one of the real concerns that we have at the Institute is that the current evidence already shows that part-time workers really don't get promoted. Statistically, it's very unlikely you're going to get promoted if you work part-time. We already have a 2-tier workforce. One of the risks of our going forward is that this opportunity of flexible working, if we end up with 3 tiers, those in central head office at least some of the time, perhaps those in remote hubs or mixing their time, and then those who are completely remote workers, could we actually end up reinforcing and re-entrenching inequalities? And so we think it's really, really important that as we go forward, jobs are designed to think about how do we mix working from home and working from the office? How do we make sure that we're actually measuring outputs rather than presence, be that online presence or remote presence? And that's a very brief summary of what we found. It's a big report with lots of findings, and I see that Caroline shared the link, so do follow up, and I'll enjoy referring back to it in the discussion.
Thanks, Rosie. With that as a backdrop, let's share additional context for today's conversation. Pre-COVID and increasingly more over the past year, we've heard the following buzzwords: more about inclusion, more about new ways of work, and then also agile working. So I'd love to hear from our panelists today. What do these concepts or what do these terms mean to you? Are there others that I've missed that are buzzwords over the past year as we think about returning to the office? And what, if anything, has changed since the COVID lockdowns started a year ago with respect to these terms and going back into the office? Harriet, I'll start with you.
Okay, so I think there's a lot in there, but I think first thing is, for me, inclusion has always been about, first of all, do you know who's in your workforce? Do you know who they really are and what they really need? And are you doing your best to facilitate that? Right? And we can't facilitate that unless we measure and monitor, and unless we have open and honest conversations. And when I've seen a lot, and Rosie talked about this, I've seen a lot of talk about remote working and how we make the office fit for the future. It's very focused on, do we have the tech and what are we going to do with the office space? And those are lovely and important questions, but you can have the best tech in the world, you can have the most glamorous office, and yet if you don't actually think about who your workforce is and what they need, they're going to leave anyway. And what the current situation is really providing us with is a chance to say, okay, well, how do we do work differently? And how do we start to think about creating a workspace that works for the business and for our teams? And I say to people that I work with, you know, when you talk about flexibility, flexibility works both ways. So flexibility is about how, as an organization, can you be flexible towards your employees? And as an employee, how can you be flexible towards the organization? But if you don't start from a place of actual inclusion and the very basic practices that are needed for good inclusion, such as measuring and monitoring, what you're going to end up with is that 2 or 3 tier system where in 5 years' time you look and you're like, this is so weird. Why is it that all of our senior leadership team look exactly the same? Didn't we do some real work around that 5 years ago? And you might have done, but if you didn't then follow it up when you started working in a more flexible, remote, hybrid, however you want to call it, manner, all that work is going out the window. And that for me is the thing that I think organizations really need to be concentrating on right now is, do we have our inclusion policies right now before we start kicking everybody out of the office and coming up with new working patterns?
Excellent advice. Rosie, what about you?
Yes, I think we're talking about flexibility all the time. And I think that flexibility when, for example, schools and childcare providers were shut, people had to work out, how am I going to work and do this? So maybe I'm going to work till midnight or 1 in the morning. One of the danger is that we've actually potentially could have fake flexibility. I really think Harriet's point about flexibility going both ways is really important. Sometimes we've got something really critical going on at work and we have to put everything to one side. But if that becomes the standard modus operandi, so that always on just becomes always online, then actually we risk burnout, we risk poor performance, we risk bad decisions, and we risk excluding people from the workplace. So one of the things that worries me is we seem to treat flexibility as almost synonymous with inclusion, and particularly for people with caring responsibilities. But actually, people with caring responsibilities often need predictability, so they can manage childcare, so they can pick their kids up or whatever their other responsibilities at that time. And so actually, this two-way conversation and predictability, not just flexibility, are really important.
Excellent. Neil?
I mean, I can only echo Harriet and Rosie's points. I guess just to build on a couple of those. I think what I've observed is a rise in what I describe as conscious inclusion, because I think particularly leaders and managers have had to rethink what inclusion actually means in the context of these new ways of working that we've started to evolve. So the way that you manage and engage and motivate your team members, you know, in this remote working environment is different to how it used to work, where everyone had the benefit of being in the office and in the same physical place. So although it represents a challenge, I think it's also a good opportunity, because it's encouraging leaders and managers to actively think about what inclusion actually means in the context of their organizations and their teams, and thinking about how to engender, you know, an appropriate level of flexibility that works for individuals and for the business. So I think that's one shift I've noticed. The other thing which I think has been quite an interesting trend is I guess the importance of belonging, which I kind of see as a sort of the cousin of inclusion, if you like. And I think what has been difficult for organizations this past year is how to kind of maintain those connections, those sort of ties that bind people to an organization where you don't have the benefit of face-to-face interaction. You know, it's phenomenal what technology can enable. You know, if you can imagine even 10 years ago, you know, the implications of the pandemic and how we would have operated, it would be completely different to how we've experienced it in 2020 and 2021. There is no substitute for face-to-face. And what we've seen, you know, from a Capco point of view is we almost need to rethink how we create those bonds and those points of connection with the organisation. So all those things that we maybe took for granted, like the water cooler moments, those spontaneous interactions, or those sort of, you know, lunch with your coach or your manager, or, you know, some sort of social or celebratory event. All of those things you have to really try hard to replicate to create that sense of belonging, connection. Otherwise, you could very much get up on a Monday morning, log on, do however many Zoom or Teams calls you do in a given day, and then, you know, rinse and repeat for the next 5 days. And you're sort of left wondering, you know, what is that connection to the organisation? What are those kind of proof points that really create that sense of belonging? So I think it's, you know, again, it's both a challenge and opportunity. And I think those organisations that embrace that challenge and find ways to create those strong connections and to sustain them are the ones that are really going to be successful and come out of this crisis, you know, in a stronger position, arguably, than they were to begin with.
Thank you, Neil. I want to just follow up to what all of you said. You know, it seems like we need more understanding around some of these concepts, you know, inclusion, flexibility versus predictability. Just a question, how do we equip people leaders with the tools necessary to understand what their people need? Rosie, I see you nodding. Did you want to?
Well, I think actually Harriet's point about listening and knowing who your employees are is absolutely critical, because that it's that kind of inclusive approach to leadership that means that you're going to be able to think, well, actually, is this bucket that I'm calling flexibility working for anyone? Or actually, who is exiting, who is not performing as well as they might? And that's about this kind of engagement process.
Great, thank you. Harriet, Neil, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think there's also something around, and you said this, Dee, which is like equipping managers to feel empowered to work your organization's flexible working policies for their team. So different teams are going to have different needs. And what I see a lot is an organization will go away and they'll do a really big research piece and they'll come up with a really beautiful flexible working policy and they're really proud of it. And then somebody goes, but hang on, that doesn't work for my team because we don't all work in that manner, or actually we can't work separately, or actually it doesn't work with you. And what you need is to say, okay, well, actually there is a piece of work which is, as an organization, what do we mean by flexible working? But then there is also a piece of work which says, how do we empower team leaders to have those conversations with their team around what flexible working looks like in their team, and understand that it's not going to look the same throughout the whole organization, and that is okay. And that really is a piece about teaching team leaders how to coach their teams, how to have honest conversations, and how to engender trust. And that's a really interesting training piece that I think not a lot of organizations have really invested in enough yet.
Great takeaway.
I'd wholeheartedly agree with the points on listening to employees and empowering managers. I guess the additional point I'd make is around mindset, really. And I think it's about starting from a position that the answer is yes on flexibility. You know, I'm a bit cynical about the flexible working legislation we have in the UK, because I think it makes it too easy for employers to say no. You know, we even give them we even give employers a list of 8 reasons to say no to flexible working. Whereas really, I think we should be starting from a position of the answer being yes. And it may be that, you know, there's a conversation around the mechanics of the flexible working and what implications it has for the team and how to mitigate any issues. But if you start from the default that we can make it work and then work from there, it's a lot better than starting from oh, this is a change and this is going to be difficult and I'm not sure this is going to work. And that's certainly the mindset that I adopt and that we take in terms of how we put our policy into practice at Capco. You know, Save said that we always will at least trial, you know, a flexible working request, and I think that's the thing. You know, agile is one of these other buzzwords, and that's all about learning and iterative development. And it's a bit like that with flexibility. You know, you won't solve it immediately, you won't get it right every time, and you may need to make some changes. But I think going in with a mindset of flexibility is inherently a good thing and can be a force for good. Just having that mindset is actually half the battle.
Thank you, Neil. Rosie, as we think about returning to work and, to Neil's point around the spontaneous conversation at the water cooler, or Harriet sharing that, listening and checking in with employees as a way that managers can understand what's going on and how to manage inclusion. Let's talk about sort of what employees need versus what employees want in this environment. Do you think there's a disconnect there?
I think there really can be. I really loved Neil's last point, and I don't know if colleagues on the call have followed Zurich Bank's announcement that they've now made all positions available as flexible, part-time or full-time, and they've had a 30% increase of women in management positions. So Neil, I strongly support what you're saying. Yeah, I think there's a real danger that I might sound as if I'm preaching a theory of false consciousness here. I do think we have to be a bit careful sometimes in giving people exactly what we say we want. Because what we say we want might be the result of external pressures pushing us in a position that actually isn't in our long-term best interest. So if I take the example of perhaps a working mother, we know from the gender pay gap that statistically it's more likely that she's economically going to have less bargaining power in the household. So if she's given the option of you can work at home all the time, or maybe you can be hybrid, or maybe you can be in the office full time, there might be external pressure to say, do you know what, my life is just going to be easier if I work at home all the time. The danger from that is the research shows that if you're at home all the time, you're going to pick up the domestic load, and that can have an iterative effect on your ability to progress through an organization. Now, whereas if your employer said to you, do you know what, I want to support you, just as Neil said, I want you to have flexibility, but let's also think what's in your interest and what's in the firm's interest. And we really think that a certain amount of face-to-face interaction is good for your role. Let's say 2 days a week in the office, etc. You can then go home and say, well, they want me in 2 days. You've got that bargaining power. So I really think it's so important to think about, what do we want from this job? What do we want from this role? What does the employee say they want? And what will help them get promoted? And put all of those factors into a conversation rather than allowing immediate pressure, perhaps to exacerbate the inequalities we see in work already.
Thank you, Rosie. Audience, we'd like to hear from you in a poll. As we think ahead to offices reopening, what would be your preferred number of days a week back in the office? So we'll give everyone just a few seconds to respond.
I don't even have an office, and I still had a preference for that. I was like, oh, a year of working from home under lockdown, just put me in an office, joy.
Great.
In the meantime, we also had a question for Rosie. Rosie talked about a company that had a 30% increase in female leadership. Was it one particular company, or was it broader?
It was a wonderful study that Zurich Bank did with the behaviour insights team. I hope I've not oversimplified it. It's really worth going to have a look. They did a randomized control trial of how they advertised promotions, and they were so pleased with the success of it that they've now offered all roles in that format. So do go and have a look.
Excellent, thank you.
Great. It looks like the results of the poll are in, and 64% would prefer to be in the office 2 days a week, followed by 3 days a week at 31%. So there's no one on this call that wants to be back in the office 5 days a week, and really no one on the call that wants to not go into the office. So I think that hybrid way of working, sometime in the office and then also sometime working from home is what people tend to want on this call. So thank you for sharing that with me. Harriet, speaking of WFH, your book covers career development for employees who work from home. In what ways has working from home during the pandemic differed from traditionally remote roles or those with work from home flexibility? And then as you're talking about it, do you have any advice for people who are looking to advance their career while working from home? And in that, what does advocating for yourself look like? So if we think about it just from the context of what is this like now, because we know that this is a very different set of circumstances, and then how can you build your career while working from home?
Definitely. I mean, I think there is, I say throughout the whole book, and I say to pretty much everyone that I ever talk about this with, working from home during a pandemic is not like working from home at any other time. I have worked from home solidly for 5 years, and this year has not mirrored any of them. So if you have experienced what I think all of us have experienced in the past year, which is feelings of isolation, of burnout, of stress, of a kind of lack of connection to those around you, that is not indicative of a remote working practice. It's indicative of trying to do your job in completely unusual and unheard of situation, right? So just give yourself a break on that one. That's the first thing. And I also say to everyone, also literally give yourself a break. Like, none of us have been on holiday for a year and most of us are at burnout point. So if you're just like, this is awful, I hate it, know that what you're experiencing now isn't the reality of a flexible working life. Okay. So that's the first thing. The second thing is thinking about kind of how we develop our careers going forward. There are two really important things to think about here when you are, particularly now if you're talking to your boss about what that return to work looks like. So the first thing is really thinking about how we manage our energy and ensure that we kind of bring our most productive selves to work. So the stat I like to hit everybody with is that if you regularly work over 45 to 50 hours a week, you are at much higher risk of things like heart disease, Alzheimer's, early death, etc., etc. And also you are not getting any more work done, right? So you're working kind of 60, 70, 80 hours a week, but the impact of that on your energy levels is so great that actually the amount of work you get done is the same as if you really stopped and rested properly. So this is the time to think about, okay, how can I design my working life so that actually it fits with the rest of my life, it fits with my energy, and it's going to allow me to have a really long career, because let's face it, most of us could be working for a really long time. So that's the first thing. Think about like designing your life and designing your working life around your life, rather than what we've traditionally done, which is kind of fitted our life around work. And then, and in doing that, that's going to allow you to have a longer career. It's going to allow you to have the energy and drive to really go after the stuff that you want. And then the second thing to think about is actually, how do I get much more conscious about the connections I make and how I practice those connections? And this is something that we particularly have to be conscious about when we are working from home versus in the office, because we don't have those water cooler moments in the office. Although there was a lovely survey actually from Microsoft, which said that it looked at kind of how people had been communicating over the past year. And what it found was that actually the kind of the water cooler moment is in fact a myth. So what we tend to do in the office is we tend to network with people we already like and know. We're not building new connections, right? We're just having a chat with our mate in the coffee queue. So if we know that, then we know that actually if we want to build out our networks, we have to be really conscious about how we do it. So I used to work with a guy who just whatever he wanted, it happened. Like nobody ever questioned him. He had the best team. He had the most funding for his team. Whatever project he wanted, he got. And when I once asked him how it was that nobody ever said no to him, he said, it's like, I'm going to tell you my secret. And my secret is that I spend 60% of my time internal networking. To which my response was, well, no wonder I do so much of your work. But if you can kind of take what he said with a good spirit, actually, even if you dedicated an hour, 2 hours a week to internal networking, if you did that consistently for a year, you would have rocketed your career and really enhanced your network. And it's really easy to do that when we're working from home, because internal networking can be dropping somebody an email to say you really enjoyed a project they worked on, or dropping somebody a quick WhatsApp or a quick chat to say, I've seen you've done this and it looks really great, or actually, I'm working on this project, I want to get you involved, how do I do that? It can be short and sharp in a way that it's not in the office. So thinking about how you can dedicate some of that time to doing your online promotion of yourself is really important, because you're not going to have the chance to do it in front of people.
Harriet, that's all very, very sound advice. And so what I heard you saying there was really be intentional. I heard you use the term design your work life. And I think you're so right. Often we come from a place of we just work with what we're given, as opposed to really being thoughtful and strategic about what we'd like to have happen. And the point about being intentional goes back to Neil when he was talking about, conscious inclusion, really conscious internal networking as well. How are we spending our time? Who are we connecting with? And really what's our strategy around that to develop our careers? So thank you for that. Go ahead.
One of the lovely things about working from home is that actually it kind of takes us out of the rat race track, right? So we're not sat next to somebody, we're not instantly comparing ourselves to them going, well, hang on, they've just gone for this promotion, so I should too. Or they're working on this issue, so I should be too. actually we can sit back and say, what's the stuff I love? What's stuff I'm good at? How do I get more of that in my working life?
Right. Yep. And increased visibility across the organization as well. And so I think that's one of the things that technology affords us. So now that we understand more about the impact of working from home on an individual's career development, let's talk about what opportunities companies have to get it right. And another poll question for our audience. And I think, Rosie, in your data points from the research, we talked about this, the impact that the pandemic has had on people's careers. But another question for our audience, as you think about the last year, has your career progressed, regressed, or stalled? So give people just a few seconds to respond there. Really interested to see what the experience has been for people on our call today. And then Neil, will pop over to you. Great. Just a few more seconds. And I think also in the chat, we know now how to get access to Harriet's book. Okay, outstanding. So 66% of the participants on today's call or who responded to the survey say that their career has progressed over the past 12 months. 31% say that it's stalled. And then unfortunately, 3% say that it's gone backwards. So Neil, with that as context, if we think about companies from an organizational perspective, what should companies be paying attention to? And how do new ways of working affect people in different ways in different jobs? So we've talked about sort of this three-tiered model, but if we think about it with respect to the level of seniority, the type of job that people hold within an organization, impact on neurodiversity, just across the board, how do these new ways of working affect people? And then I'll follow up with a second question.
Sounds good. I mean, firstly, I'm pleasantly surprised actually by that poll. That's sort of quite reassuring to see the positivity there, because I think there's certainly research pointing towards the fact that it's put the brakes on career development for certain demographics. So to see such an overwhelming positive response is certainly encouraging to see. So I guess the first point I'd make is that the experience is very personal. I think we can talk about demographic trends and some of the groups more effective than others, and that holds true. But I think ultimately it's a very personal experience, and you could have two people who, from a demographic point of view, look and seem the same, but they will have experienced the last 12 months extremely differently, and that will depend on a whole multitude of factors that I think we're probably all pretty cognizant of. In terms of their home office setup, the responsibilities, their role, the dynamics of the team, reporting lines, commitments they've got outside work. All of those things kind of come to bear in affecting how people experience the way we've been working the last 12 months and the way we're starting to move towards this new way of working. So with that being said, there's probably 3 points I'd pull out. One is that I think from conversations I've had both with people inside the organization but also in my external network, what's apparent is that middle managers are probably the most squeezed and have maybe felt the most pressure from the changes we've experienced in ways of working. And I think what's come across is that they like everyone else have to deal with the kind of personal impact in terms of how they work and how they go about their business and how they prioritize. But because they're often the sort of frontline managers who are leading teams on the ground and responsible often for quite broad spans of control, they're also helping the adaptation of all of their team members. So they're sort of taking the weight of the world on their shoulders. And that as a result, they felt quite a lot of pressure from the expectations upon them. Whereas people sort of either side, either at a more senior level, because arguably they have more autonomy and can exercise more discretion over how they go about their work, or people at a more junior level who undoubtedly have been affected, but at least they can kind of focus on themselves and the people immediately around them. Whereas it's those middle managers in the middle that are somewhat squeezed, and I think arguably need the most support from their organizations. So I'll maybe come on to that again in a minute. The second piece I'd highlight, and this is actually, I think, a real sort of reason for positivity, is that I think as what we've seen in terms of ways of working over the last year and how 97%, I think Rosie highlighted, as organizations expecting and moving towards hybrid working, is that it starts to break down some of the barriers to attracting diverse talent. Things such as location, the ability to do a daily commute, having a rigid, working pattern. As those things assume less importance, it actually helps break down some of those barriers to attracting diverse talent. And I think, in the past, a lot of people, particularly with parental and caring responsibilities, have felt like they've needed to make a choice between lifestyle and career, and that the two have, in some cases, been mutually exclusive. But I think with the new future of work, we actually have an opportunity to see a coming together of those two things, so that people no longer have to make a choice between lifestyle and work and career, and they can actually have their cake and eat it and realise both. So I think that's, that gives me a lot of cause for optimism, and the results of that poll, do kind of endorse that. And then the third and final point I was going to make was just around neurodiversity. We have a neurodiversity at Capco network, and I've had some really interesting conversations with them. And what it's actually shown is that people identifying as neurodivergent, in some cases, they've really thrived with this new way of working. So I talked to one individual who says he talks about how they find social settings at work very daunting. And the whole idea of networking is anathema to them. It's the last thing they would want to do in their working life. And coming into a sort of large meeting room and being expected to contribute and influence discussion is, literally gives them palpitations. Whereas moving towards the kind of remote working model, they've actually felt quite empowered, because they felt more able to contribute in these kind of forums, because they've got more time to reflect on how they want to talk and what they want to position, how they ask questions. And it's actually enabled them to really progress, get a lot more job satisfaction, and feel like they're really growing in terms of their career and personal development. So I think it's, there are definite opportunities to be realised here from an inclusion point of view. And I guess my message to organisations and leaders would be to really think about these things consciously, and to look to embrace the opportunities that new ways of working present, but also to look at it at a very individual level and think about and to listen to what individual employees need.
So, Neil, what steps can companies take to help mitigate against any negative impacts, or to leverage the opportunities that you just outlined?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess a good place to start would be, I alluded to the affinity group we have, neurodiversity at Capco, and we have other groups, covering several different strands of diversity. We have Pride at Capco, Women at Capco, Ability at Capco. So we have a range of these networks, and I think they're an immensely valuable source of insight and feedback from employees on the ground. So I think, having these groups, and I'm sure, the participants on this call, you'll be in organisations with those groups. So where you have them, I would say really tap into them and listen to what they're saying, because they're probably most connected to people on the ground, and can give you incredibly valuable feedback that you can act on. And even if you don't have those networks, I'd still encourage you either to set them up if you can, or even if not, at least to create forums for listening to employees and having that two-way dialogue between employees and leaders. So that would be my first piece of advice. I guess the second piece would really be to hone in on that middle manager group. And I think there's two aspects to this. One, I think, is about skill. One is about well-being. In terms of skills, I think it's about equipping them to lead and manage teams remotely. Whereas some of the sort of disciplines of management hold true, whether you're, face-to-face or remote working or a combination of the two. I think particular skills around collaboration, effective communication, they become paramount in this environment we're working at the moment. So giving managers the skills and confidence to work in that way and to lead teams is vital. And then the other side of the coin around well-being, I think it's looking about the support you've got in place to support the mental and emotional health and well-being of your managers. I think Rosie quoted a statistic of 55% of organisations are looking at support they provide employees, particularly returning to the office. Really that should be 100%. A lot of employers are probably putting plans in place for returns to the office, if not already realising them. And if they're doing that without considering the acclimatisation challenge and the impact that will have on people's health and well-being, they're missing a trick. So I think that's really important. And then lastly, in terms of the opportunity I talked about, in terms of tapping into hitherto untapped talent pools, I think organisations really need to think about their approach to sourcing new talent. As I say, this is a great opportunity to look beyond the traditional barriers of location and the sort of classic full-time working model, you know, harking back to Henry Ford in the 1920s. You know, if we can kind of jettison that approach and be very open-minded in where and how we look for talent, then it's going to open up, you know, talent pools that perhaps we haven't been able to reach before. So I think organisations that do that are going to be very well equipped to succeed in the future world of work.
Thank you. Rosie, as we go back, and Rosie and Harriet, as we go back to talking about the data, what should companies be paying attention to with respect to new ways of working, inclusion? What should we be measuring? Rosie, I'll start with you, and then Harriet, I'll go back to the monitor and measure mantra that you discussed before.
Well, I think the kinds of things that firms have been measuring so far are the kind of things we should still be focusing on in terms of employee engagement, but also taking a really systematic view to inclusion as a core business objective. And I think going forward, when there's going to be so much change in how we work, really monitoring who is progressing, who is exiting, who is in the organization at entry level, who, you know, the speeds of progress and exit, and making sure that there's not bias in there. And really, if you treat that as a core business objective because you recognize that diversity of thought is such an asset, then actually, having worked with a few companies on this, I can see that it's eminently achievable. And all of the issues that have been raised by Neil and Harriet, it's about actually thinking about them through all of your processes and really making sure that you've got good, both quantitative and qualitative outcome measures. I also saw there was a brief question about new joiners, and I think this relates in that thinking about how hybrid working works for people at different stages of their career and different kind of life experiences. You're going to need to monitor and think about that. And one of the things is thinking about what is face-to-face contact for? Well, a huge part of what it might be for is joining up new joiners with senior leaders and making sure that seniors leaders face-to-face time is benefiting new joiners. So I think it's about thinking about all these processes really carefully and differentiating your staff and making sure they're all having a good experience.
Great, thanks. Harriet?
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that. I think that traditionally when organizations are trying to measure inclusion, what they essentially measure is diversity, and they do that based on essentially protected characteristics, so gender, race, age, ability, etc. And that is, I think, important that we do monitor that stuff, because if we don't, we know strange things happen. It just doesn't, people just forget about it and they don't know why. So it's really important we monitor that. And I think we can add into it. So I think we don't want to end up in a world where we say flexibility is you are officially in the office 3 days a week and anything, but we should be saying, actually, can we measure how often people are in an office, how often people are remote, and can we check in on that? Can we measure part-time versus full-time? Can we measure, I would love to get away from part-time versus full-time, quite frankly. I'm just like, can we measure productivity better so that we get to a point where you do the job and it takes you as long to do the job as it takes you? And rather than this strange world where if you get the job done first, we reward you by giving you more work, we just say that's the job and get the job done. So how do we monitor and measure some of that? And the really interesting one is going to be, how do we start teaching managers how to measure productivity? And that's really about how do they become better managers themselves, so better at setting goals, setting tasks, and then better at actually measuring what's happening on those tasks as they go. I would say on the new joiner point, this is a really interesting one, because we've seen that that's like the big argument for why flexible remote working doesn't work, that we can't train people if they're remote. I mean, I would argue that this isn't to say we're not going to have a remote or flexible policy because we can't train our new joiners properly is really essentially just, I mean, it's a bit of it's a cop-out, isn't it? It's a cop-out, because what you're saying is we don't know how to train people unless we're sat in front of them. And actually what we should be saying is, do you know what? We do not have good new joiner policies. Oh, that my car outside agrees with me on that point. We do not have good new joiner policies. We need to be better at that. How do we change that system so that when people arrive, we really help them embed into the organization as quickly as we can? I think we know that really on average, it takes somebody about 6 months to know what their job is when they first join an organization. So we should be thinking about, do you know what? Actually, that's not great. the process we've got for new joiners right now doesn't work. So why are we going back to the process that doesn't work as opposed to recreating it and trying to come up with something that does work?
Absolutely. Neil, anything to add there?
Yeah, I guess just picking up on that point around new joiners, I think there's also a lot of power in sort of introducing new joiners in cohorts. Like, you know, obviously this depends on the kind of volume of hiring that your organisation is doing at the moment, but I think there's an element of new joiners. They obviously learn from people already in the business, but I think part of it is almost an element of solidarity with people like them joining at the same time, going through the same process of acclimatization. So if you can kind of get that nice balance between the kind of learning stuff about your organization, you know, and understanding all the ways of working, you know, and then also having that sort of sense of being part of a new community and people, you know, that initial network, you can get the balance between those two, then it's very powerful. I think there's also plenty of scope for creativity. Again, I think we're lucky that we have the technology we do at our disposal. You know, I think we've tried to be creative around what we do on things like our induction programs to make them more interactive. You know, having things like these polls and having things like interactive working boards where, you know, people can, you know, innovate and come up with ideas and brainstorm together. So I think it just, you know, they say necessity is the mother of all invention. I think that's probably the most salient phrase for the last year. So I think if we're kind of open-minded and think about new ways to do things, then I think we'll actually carry some of this through. And like you say, Harriet, I don't think it's a case of once we see more of a return to office working, we simply do what we did in 2019. You know, that would be a terribly retrograde step. I think we can actually take the best of what we had in 2019 with the best of what we've done in 2020 and hopefully end up with something significantly better for, you know, 2021 onwards.
Thank you, Neil. So as we get towards our last question before Q&A, I do want to say that this has been an amazing conversation. And so as we think about how we set this off as how can we leverage this time or the times that we're in as an inflection point, I think our conversation here today has given us lots of nuggets and ways that we can think as team leaders, as employees, also as folks who are setting policies and developing new programs, given us lots of ways that we can rethink what work looks like for people. We can rethink how we lead our teams. We have plenty of opportunities to learn and grow. And I think this conversation has given us lots of actionable takeaways. But I'd like to know from you all, what are the two or three things that you would leave participants with to go and do after today's conversation? Harriet, I'll start with you.
So I think the first one is for individuals. I would say go away and think about what has really worked for you over the past 12 months and what hasn't worked. And then have a really open and honest conversation with your boss about that. So if the reality is that actually you have been working in a flat share with 5 other people and everybody trying to do the Monday morning check-in on Zoom means the internet just crashes, like, we need to talk about that. That's an issue. So go away and look at what has worked that you want to keep and think about how you explain why to your boss, and what hasn't worked that you need to change. That's the first thing. And then for managers, I would say go away and really think about the question, and I say to everybody, but it goes to the question of, do you know what your team are doing? And not do you know what you think they should be doing, but do you know what they're actually doing? And if you're not sure, or you don't know, then now is the time to think about, okay, how can I be creative in understanding and helping my team tell me what they're up to, so that we can all change our culture of presenteeism into a culture of productivity, which is what I hope we take from this experience.
Thanks. Rosie.
I would direct mine to people in an organization who are in a position to kind of bring about change. And I'd say, really think hard. Are you focusing in your performance evaluations on outputs? Or are you focusing too much on presence, be that online or offline? And then I'd also think about, are we promoting and creating a culture that gets the best from everyone? Or is there a risk that we sometimes valorize over work instead of thinking about genuine two-way flexibility?
Thank you, Rosie. Neil?
Well, I really should have compared notes with Harriet, because my first one was the same. I was going to say start with yourself, but I'm glad we're on the same page, because I think it's a terrible trait of HR that often as HR practitioners we think of ourselves last, and we need to practice what we preach. So I think start with yourself, and as Harriet says, understand what has and hasn't worked in the last year, and then have an open and honest conversation with your managers about it. So I think that's a great first tip. The second one, we sort of briefly touched on it at the start around some of the kind of hot buzzwords at the moment, and agile being one of them. So I guess my point there would be to sort of not get too hung up on, I guess, the technicalities of it, and I guess the kind of the origins of it in the sort of IT technology space, and to see agile more as to see agility more as a sort of behavioural competence that we want all of our people to demonstrate, and our organisation as a whole. I think if you kind of get past that, then you start to really realise the benefits of agility, because the reality is we're going to continue to be operating in a very volatile and unpredictable environment. So the more as organisations, teams and individuals we can be agile and respond to those challenges and adapt and learn from mistakes and evolve, then the better equipped we're going to be for this new world of work and the challenges it throws at us. So I think be agile about being agile is what I'd end on.
Great, thank you, Neil. I see we have a question in the chat. And so Harriet, I'll actually point this one to you. Could you share some advice on being visibly good at your job while being invisible during remote working, especially in a sector where long working hours are considered a sign of dedication?
I mean, so this is a really perfect opportunity for you to educate your manager in why long hours don't necessarily equal productivity. And so I would say the first thing is, first of all, set some boundaries. So I encourage people to actually put in their email signature and in their calendar when they are and are not available. So if you know you're not going to be picking up emails after 6 p.m, or if you know that you are going to finish at 3 p.m. to pick up your kid and you'll be back online at 7 p.m, or whatever it is, tell people that so they know. And then the second thing is, I love this question about being visibly good. It's really easy. You send a weekly update email and you just phrase it like this. You say, I know we're all out of the office at the moment, so you can't see what I'm up to. So I thought it'd be really helpful for you just to give you a weekly breakdown of what I've achieved this week. And then you put the top things that you have achieved in short bullet points. You want them to be able to read it in 5 minutes. Short bullet points. You big up what you've done. You point out all the stuff that you've finished off. You say what you're going to be up to next week, and then you sign off with have a great weekend, and you are done for the week. And that is the way to do it, because that way what we're actually focusing on, it's Rosie said, the outputs, what you have achieved, not how long you have been online in order to do it. And if you feel uncomfortable doing that, and some people do, some people feel like it's a bit showy-offy or whatever, just remember it's your boss's job to know what you are doing. So you are helping them by sending them that email, right? You are helping them do their job. And if you want to be really brilliant, I would suggest you copy in their boss too, but that's up to you.
Great. Thanks, Harriet.
That's
Caroline, back to you.
Yeah, that's right. Great tip from Harriet there. And as we only have a minute left for the event, I just want to thank you all, Dee, Rosie, Harriet and Neil, for joining our panel today. Thank you to everyone else for joining us as well and sharing your insights. I hope you found the event thought-provoking and informative. We'll send you a follow-up email with the event recording, and you'll also find the link to the research that Rosie mentioned. I can also heavily recommend Harriet's book, which is fantastic, full of great tips and humorous touches. If you could spare a moment to complete the survey using the QR code that's shown on your screen now, that would be very helpful, as your feedback helps us produce better events for you. Our calendar at Women in Banking and Finance is packed with more exciting events in the coming weeks and months. Tomorrow at 5 p.m, new and existing members have a chance to find out about how to maximize their membership and take advantage of all our benefits and resources. There is still time to register for the event tomorrow, and you can find all the details on our events page. Next week, we have 2 more events open to our members. The first one on the government's Eat Well guide, and the second one on the new stewardship code and its impact on gender balance. More events can be found online. We're constantly uploading more events for you to attend, so do check out our webpage as well as our regular events newsletter. If you're interested in joining Women in Banking Finance, you'll find all the information you need on our website. And finally, I'd just like to mention the research program that started last year, a multidisciplinary 4-year cross-industry project. And again, you will be able to find all the details on our website. So once again, a huge thank you to our Chair Dee and our panelists, and to Capco, our partner for this event. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.